Hello everyone, and welcome to HTML Level 2. We finally reached the Level 2 of HTML section of the course, and this section of the course is really going to focus on two topics, tables and forms. And overall it's going to consist of a lecture on tables, then a tables quiz, basically allowing you to practice tables with HTML, then we'll talk about how to use forms with HTML, and then we'll finally have an assessment test at the end where you get to practice using forms with HTML. Once we finish this section of the course, we're going to be ready to dive into CSS to start styling our HTML. And a quick note, while HTML may seem pretty basic and possibly boring at sometimes, at first, we really need it to build a good foundation for our knowledge later on. So you can think of this section almost as eating your vegetables before you get to go on to the main course and then later on dessert. Okay, let's go ahead and get started by talking about tables. I'll see you at the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome to part 1 where we're going to be discussing tables in HTML. Tables in HTML consist of several tags working together. And those tags are the general table tag that lets your HTML know that there's going to be a table here. Then there's the t-head tag, which allows you to actually set the first row or the header row of the table. And then inside of that you have th, which are the actual elements that we're going to be placing inside of that header or head row, that very top row. Essentially the name of the columns in the table. And then beyond that you have the table rows, and then you have TD for each of the table elements inside corresponding to each column. Now here I've shown the breakdown with just the opening tags. Every opening tag would later on have a corresponding closing tag. So with that being said, let's go ahead and construct the table to understand all of this and get a real sense of how all these different tags work together. I'm going to jump to the Atom text editor now. Alright, here I am at the Atom text editor, and I also have a browser open to the HTML file I'm working with right now, which is just called tables.html. You can call your HTML file whatever you want. Let me just collapse that side directory so we can see the full HTML file a little better. The first tag we're going to need is the table tag, which is basically going to declare that we have a table. And I'm just going to autocomplete that there. And everything we're working with is going to go inside these table tags. First thing we want to do after that is the table head, which is t-head. And this is where your column names are going to go. So right now if we save this and refresh our web page, we don't see anything because we really don't have any content in the table yet. But as I put a th, which is basically the actual content that goes in the table head, we'll do something like number. Now my table will show something, and here it is, just a number. And let's add a couple more th elements or th tags for something like color, and then let's add another one, th, and we'll do country. Save that, refresh over here. And now I have number, color, country. And note how they're aligned. They're aligned as if they are the titles of the column names that are going to be coming up. So now the question is, how do we actually add rows to the table? And then how do we actually add table cells? Well, outside of this t-head, we say tr, and that's going to stand for a table row. And now what we can do is inside of this table row, put in td for table cells. So let's start off with a number, and that corresponds with the first column, which is the number column. Let's put in the next cell, and this is in the first row, that first TR, and now we need a color. Let's put in something like red. And now let's put in a country, let's just say USA. We'll save this and refresh, and now we can see that we're actually starting to construct a table. Let me zoom in on this so it's a little more clear. Okay, so we can see we're actually constructing a table. A lot of times you want your table to actually have a border, and we'll be discussing styling tables a lot more when we talk about CSS. But a quick way to do it is in this table tag, just do a space and add in border. And Atom text editor is actually going to help you out here. And if you just hit enter here, it'll automatically fill out border for you. And then just pass in a number like 1. And then when you refresh this after passing that number in, you get to see this auto border created. And like I mentioned, there's a lot more styling you can do instead of getting like such an ugly border for your table. But right now, this will help us differentiate rows and columns. Okay. Let's practice adding in one more row. Again, it's tr for the table row, and then td for the table cell. And let's see what happens if we just add in one table cell value. So if I just put in 100, and I click save and refresh here, note that I'd still get that 100 value. So I can still add in values and basically have blank values for certain columns. Now it's always suggested that you try to fill out your table completely, but just keep that in mind that your table will still be able to generate. There won't be an error thrown at all if you only have one corresponding value for your row. So let's fill that in. Next one we want is a color. Let's just say blue. Whoops. And let's put in one more, which is going to be a country, and let's just say France. I'm going to save that, and let's refresh, and there we have it. One more row. Okay, and that's really all there is to creating tables in HTML. It's pretty straightforward. Let's just quickly review the steps. Everything we've done goes inside these table tags. We have an opening one and a closing one. And then if you want to have a border here, you can just say border is equal to, and then in quotes here I've put in 1. If we put in larger numbers, such as 5, basically what's going to happen is you will get a thicker border. Now I'm zoomed in here, so the effect is a little more pronounced, but let's make it really large, so we'll say 50, and then refresh. You can see we get a extremely thick border on the outside. So you may be wondering, well, how do I actually edit these borders on the inside? That's something we're going to discuss a lot more in the CSS section of the course. For right now, you can just put in 1, and that should make things clear enough as far as what's a row and what's a column. Okay, then after that, we have the T-head section. And the T-head section is differentiated from the TR section in the sense that it's actually just the column name. So it represents, and it's in bold versus just a regular text. So we see number, color, country, you can call these whatever you want. And that basically defines how many columns your table is going to have. Now, if we remove this, T-head, let me just cut that out, save this, and refresh, you still get a table just fine. So I don't want to give the impression that every table requires a T-head tag. You can build a table without T-head, so that's totally fine. But you should try to, at least for a viewer's sake, keep in mind, is it readable without the T-head? And here I've put in the T-head back in. And for T-head, those elements are under the TH tag. Then everything else is a TR for T-row, the table row, and then each table cell inside of those rows is just TD. And you have to place them in the order that the columns come in, which is why we choose T-head, so we can always make sure we have a reference that corresponds to the actual order of the elements. Alright, that's basically it. Thanks everyone, and I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back everybody to Part 2 Tables Quiz. So you've actually learned enough in the previous lecture to get some practice creating your own tables. I want you to open the txt or text file inside of the HTML level 2 folder called part2_table_quiz.txt. And there are some instructions there that we're going to be exploring right now. But basically for this exercise, you're going to be recreating a table based off the information provided in that text file. Let's take a quick look at that text file and then show you an example of what the end result will look like. I'm going to jump to the Atom text editor now. Alright, so I've opened up that table quiz.txt file here, and basically what you're going to be doing is using the following information to make a table about country GDP. And it says pop quiz here, but I kind of warned you about this already, so it's not really a totally pop quiz. All the source for this data is from this Wikipedia link on the list of countries by GDP. And what I want you to do is make a table of HTML consisting of 3 main columns. The country name, the country flag, so that will be an image, and then GDP in millions of US dollars. And your table will have 3 rows, and you'll use the information below to attribute it to the cells correctly. So you have United States as the first country's name, you have a link for the US flag, so you can see here I have the Wikipedia link to an image of that flag, and then the actual number for GDP, which is here 18,561,930. Then we have India, and I'll have the Indian flag as a link there, and then their GDP, and then we have the United Kingdom, the UK flag, which is a link here, and then their GDP. Let me show you very quickly what the final result you will be creating actually looks like. And here I have open what the basic final result will look like. Notice that I've created a border. We have those 3 columns, the country name, country flag, GDP in millions of US dollars, and then we have those 3 rows. And that's basically all there is to it as far as what you're going to be creating. So try your best, just based off of this text file and the information here, to open up a brand new HTML file and recreate this table that looks like this. So 3 rows, 3 columns. A little bit of a tricky part that we haven't shown yet is how to actually insert an image here, but it shouldn't be too different than what we've done before. In fact, you should already know how to do it based off everything we've covered. So definitely take your time, explore, reference Google if you need it, but coming up next is going to be the walkthrough solutions to this exercise. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture. Everyone, and welcome to Part 3 Tables Quiz Solutions. In this lecture, we're just going to be coding through the solutions for the table quiz. Let's get started. Alright, so I have my text editor open, and I have my browser open to this tables.html file, which is currently blank. Let me collapse that directory screen, and here I have the actual text file with the quiz instructions, so I can reference this data later on. And remember, we want to just create a table with those 3 columns and 3 rows. Let's start off by just creating the HTML file itself. Luckily, we just have to type HT, hit enter, and everything's automatically created there for us. And then here in the body, I'm going to just say something like table, and let's insert a header just to make sure we're properly linked, or a heading, I should say. And we'll say table, quiz, save that, Let's refresh this, and here we see table quiz. So we know these are linked together, so we're good to go. I can just delete that heading now, since I know it's linked. And now I have the table. The first thing of this table that I want to create is the t-head element. And remember, the t-head, or the table head, is what actually has the column names. So it has the column names in bold there. And that takes in th cells, instead of the regular td cells. And my first column will be the country name. My second column will be the country flag. And then my third column, remember, is the GDP in millions of US dollars. So let's save that and make sure it actually worked for us by refreshing over here. And there we have country name, country flag, GDP, millions of US dollars. But remember that the actual solutions, it looked like it had a border to it. And we covered how to create a border back in the tables lecture. You just come up here to tables, select border equal to, and let's just put in, let's say 2. Then we refresh, and now we have that nice border. Now it's just a matter of filling in the information. So the information we have has to go under table rows, or TR tags. So here's a table row, and let's start by filling in the first table cells. So the first one we have is USA. That's the first table cell. Then the second one we have, TD, is going to be the actual image of the flag. And in order to put that in, we need to call an image tag. So we didn't actually show this in the table lecture, but all you have to do is just type in image and then put in the source. So we have this image tag that we worked with earlier, and it's just nested inside this TD, or table cell tag. And that's really all you had to do for that. Let's grab that USA flag link. So I will copy and paste it from here. So let me copy that. And then paste it inside the source. Save this, and let me refresh to make sure everything worked correctly here. And there we have country flag and US. So we're linked correctly. And then finally, the last cell I want for this row is with my TD tags here. Table cell, call it. And let me zoom in a little bit so we can see a little better. It's the GDP in millions of US dollars. And from the notes, that's just right here, 18,561, etc. So let's paste that in, save it, refresh, and it looks like we're good to go here. We have the country name, country flag, and GDP. Now it's just a matter of duplicating this process for the next 2 rows. So again, we just say table row, and let's just put in the 3 cells right now. TD, TD, TD. And the next one we had was India. And then I'm going to put in that image tag again. It's just IMG, hit enter, and it automatically has the SRC, or the source, for you. And we will grab this Indian flag from Wikipedia. And a quick note, sometimes Wikipedia will change the actual links or the size of the picture. So if you're getting some distortion in the size, don't worry. We're going to cover how to actually set image sizes later on, especially during the CSS lectures. So if you get kind of funky flag sizes, don't worry about it too much. Just make sure you understand the idea of creating the table itself. Don't worry too much about these actual links. In fact, you could replace them with your own links if you wanted to. So I will just copy and paste that flag of India link right there. And then let me put in their GDP. And I have that information right over here. Copy and paste that. Save this, and let's make sure the second row worked. All right, perfect. We have India, Indian flag, and then their GDP. And then finally, it's time for the United Kingdom. We'll put in their 3 cells, TD, 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 and we're going to say United Kingdom, image, source, and then their GDP. So let's grab their GDP first. Copy and paste that in here. Save this and refresh to make sure we still have the connection. Perfect. And now it's time for their flag. So let's grab that flag link. I'm going to just copy this from the quiz notes and then paste it in here in their source. Good. Let's save that. And now with the refresh here, I see the United Kingdom flag. All right, and that's really all we had to do. So we have the country flags, USA, India, United Kingdom, their flags, and then GDP. All right, so hopefully you found that exercise pretty straightforward. Again, you can always just reference the solutions notebook, or excuse me, the solutions HTML file in case you want to actually reference the code itself. All right, thanks everyone. I hope that was straightforward, and I'll see you at the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome to Part 4, Forms Basics. Creating forms in HTML really revolves around the idea of the input tag. And throughout this lecture and the subsequent lectures, we're going to be looking at various types of inputs for forms and how we can use them to accept user input. So if you've ever visited a website where you had to input your email, a password into a form online, and then click submit, that's an HTML form. Forms are actually going to be a key component of Django later on, but in order to really understand how to use them with Django, we need to fully understand them with just pure HTML. Let's get started by looking at some basic examples. I'm going to jump to the text editor now. Alright, so I have my text editor open, and I have my browser open, and before we get started, I just wanted to show you the two reference links that you can actually find inside the Part 4 Forms Basics HTML file that corresponds with this lecture. One of them goes to the W3 Schools, where it just talks about input types. So here you can see HTML input types, and the basic form of an input tag is the input tag, and then we specify the type. And notice you can have text types, you can have password types, submit types, so it has a little submit button, and later on we're going to really be exploring a bunch of other types, such as radio buttons, drop-down, checkboxes, etc. So that's the idea behind this, and if you want a more technical reference, you can always check out the Mozilla Developer Network website, which is also linked in that HTML file. But let's get started by just kind of walking through this. So basically, what we do is somewhere in the body, you start your form. So before we actually get started, I'm going to make two headings. I'll say something like login, and then we'll say heading 2, please input your, we'll say email and password. Save that, refresh over here, and then we see login, please input your email and password. Let me just zoom in a little bit on that so it's a little clear. And here we have our two headings. Later on, we're actually going to learn how to specifically label inputs, but right now, just keeping it basic. Let's simulate a login site. First thing we have to do then is call a form. And if you want, we can actually call form like this, and now we have our form, our opening tag and our closing tag. And we see we have a class, which will make a lot more sense when we talk about CSS, so you can just ignore that for now. We have an action, which is going to be later on used to actually call an action depending on what kind of form you're using, and then we have a method, which is post. Right now, we actually don't need to worry about any of these things. We're going to talk a lot more about them, but basically the action is later on where we're going to be sending the data, and then the method has to do with a get post HTTP method. But right now, we don't know enough to really use any of these, so we're just going to delete all that and just have form. Let's save that, and let's stick our two headings inside of this form tag. And as I mentioned, the main part of creating a form really revolves around those input tags. So what we're going to do is call an input tag, and then we notice that as we call input and then hit enter, Atom Text Editor will automatically say type equals, name equals, and value equals. And so let's break this down. Type is where you actually clarify what type of input you want. And by default, it's type text. And that's something we're going to be exploring a lot through this lecture and the next couple of lectures, different types of inputs. Then you have the name of the input, and the name of the input is just the name assigned to this input, so you can call it on later in some other files. And then we have the value. And the value is the actual default value that's placed inside there. So let's explore this right now. Let's start off with one of the most common types of inputs, which is an email type. And an email type basically just checks to make sure you have an email in there. We'll give this a name, and we'll call it user email. So let's save this and refresh, and now we notice that we have an actual text box here. And what's different between a normal type equals text and a type equals email is that the email type is going to make sure later on when we actually click submit that we have an at gmail.com or at yahoo.com or an actual email in there. So for a normal text type input, you could just put in user and it would work. But for a type email, it's going to make sure that you actually have at and then a .com or a .net in there. So maybe you've been using a website, you accidentally mistype your email, and a little pop-up will say, please enter a valid email address. This is the type of input they're using to automatically do that. And basically all this work is being handled behind the scenes by your browser. Just specifying the type will basically take care of that for you. And that's really a big part of the beauty of HTML. It works across browsers that way, at least for the most common types. And then let's create another input for our password. So we'll say this type is password. We'll save it, refresh, and now you notice that we have two boxes. This was the email, and this was the password. But look what happens when I start typing in my password here. It's actually hidden from me. And that sort of default behavior is happening because I specified this type to be password, instead of just a default text or an email type. And these are the kind of types right now that you don't need to worry about memorizing them too much. You always have those reference links for the different input types that are in the Part 4 Forms Basics.html file, those two links I explained earlier. but eventually you're going to be using these inputs so often that you're going to just remember off the top of your head, oh, I need an email type, I need a password type, etc. Right now, don't worry too much about memorizing all of these. And let's go ahead and give this input a name. So we will call this just a very simple name, something like password. And that name can later be used to actually reference this. So again, you don't see anything changed here on the HTML form. And finally, let's discuss this value. So the value is if you want a value to be pre-filled there. So let's say email here, and we'll say password, please. Save that, refresh, and notice for the value, it basically has a corresponding default here. So email here, password please. But notice that right now this password please just shows up as a blank password. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to input a value here into that. And later on we'll show you some better ways of actually showing some default text there. But that's what you can use if you want it to be pre-filled. All right. And then finally, one of the most important input types is the submit. And we don't need to give that a name or value, but we just refresh, and here we have a little submit button. And this is a little submit, but look what happens here. It says, please include an @ in the email address. Email here is missing an @. So let's actually give this type submit a value. And we'll type in submit there, refresh, and notice now the submit button actually has a submit there. And you can call this whatever you want, like please click me. Save that, refresh, click me. All right, so let's explain what's going on here, because there's only 3 lines, but there's actually a lot of moving parts. So if we look at this HTML code, everything here is wrapped in form tags, and that's actually really important. That allows HTML to know that we are talking about a complete form here. Then we have 3 input types. The first one is email, the second one is password, and the third one is submit. And the key idea I want you to just take in right now is not how everything is linked and working together, but really the fact that you can call an input tag, specify a type, give it a name to reference it later on. Right now that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because we haven't really used the name yet. And then the value, which is some default value for it to have. Sometimes the default value doesn't make too sense, such as with a password type. Otherwise you just see a bunch of dots there, or asterisks. And then you sometimes really do need a value, such as with the submit button, where it just looks like an ugly button if you don't have a value there. All right, so this right now, the submit button is linked to these 2 inputs, because if I click me, it won't actually work. So it'll say something like, please include an @ in the email address. Email here is missing an @. And that's why we want to specify something like type email. So now if I say hello@yahoo.com, and then put in a password, click me, looks like it's okay. Nothing's actually happening here. It's basically just clearing it every time we click submit. We'll get into that sort of functionality later, how to actually grab information from those input cells. But right now, the very basics is you call a form tag, you call these input tags, you specify a type, you can give it a name, which we'll use later on, and you can give it a default value. Sometimes you're not going to really want a default value, such as with the password. Sometimes you really will with a submit button. All right, let's just walk through just a couple more examples, some maybe a little sillier examples of different types of inputs. And a really fun one is the choose color input, and it's just a color input. So let me show you what that looks like. I'll say something like choose color as heading 1, and heading 2 is going to be click on button, and then I'm going to specify an input. I'll hit enter there, and the type is going to be a color. So let's save that, refresh this page, and notice here it says choose a color, click on button. And this is a default color picker. So if I click on this button right here, I get this little pop-up that allows me to actually pick a color. So for instance, I can pick this purple color, I hit OK, and we can see it's changed to purple. Or I pick a bright red, hit OK, and I can see it's changed to bright red. So all of that functionality is built straight into HTML just by specifying the type is equal to color. And that's sort of a fun example. Now let's show one more, which is essentially the default. So I'm going to say heading 2, we'll say enter some text, and then we'll have some input, and we're just going to leave it as the type, the text, which is the default, and we'll say something like text goes here. We'll save it, refresh, and we'll see text goes here, which means I can type just random text here, and it works just fine. Let's zoom in a little bit, and you can see that there's really no limit on how much text I can write. Later on, we'll learn about things like a text area type, which allows us to have a larger section for like paragraphs of text. But those are just a few of the input types that you can use as you begin to create forms. So just the very basics here that we've covered. Really, all I want you to be aware of is that there's a form tag, there are input tags, and you can specify the type of input. And certain types of input will have restrictions, such as the email type will have the restriction that you need an @ symbol when you actually click that submit button. That's really all I want you to get out of this lecture for right now. In the next lecture, we're going to be talking about two more things. We'll talk about labels and how they work when you can actually label one of these inputs. And then secondly, we're going to go back and talk about that form with the action and method arguments. Remember that when I first typed in form and I had it autocomplete, it had these calls right here, an action and a method. In the next lecture, we're going to be discussing those and seeing what happens when we combine that with some sort of submit button. Okay, thanks everyone, and I will see you at the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Part 5, Forms and Labels. We've already explored the basic input tags, things such as email types, password types, and we even saw some more fun ones such as the color type of inputs. But now what we want to do is really understand how to connect these various input tags to two features, and one is an action upon clicking that submit button, and another one is actually labeling that input. The use of that label tag will allow you to add labels in front of an input in your HTML form. And we're going to be learning how to use the label as well as the for parameter inside of that label tag. And then we're also going to be exploring how to activate actions upon clicking the submit button. What we're going to do is walk through a couple of examples that further explain things that we didn't cover last time but did see last time. So if you remember from the previous lecture, when I clicked that submit button, it seemed to just refresh the page and not really do anything. And we also saw that when we created a form tag, we had that action and method key parameters that we didn't really define or talk about. Now is the time to revisit those topics and see how they really work. Let's jump to the text editor to get started. Alright, so here I am at the editor, and I also have the forms.html file open. Let's start off by recreating just a very simple form, and I will use the form tag. And notice we have that class, action, and method parameters. Right now, we're just going to ignore those and close them up, pass in input, hit enter, and then we'll say this input is just an email, and then we'll also give another input for submit. So that's the submit type of input. Something I will do, however, is add a name to this email. So last time we did this, but didn't actually really explore what happens when we add a name. So let's add a name, refresh this page, and let's add a couple more things here. I will say paragraph to enter email, and then give a value to this submit button so we see something there. So we'll say submit, save that, refresh this, and now we see something that says enter email and submit. Let's see what happens when I actually enter an email and click submit. So I will say something like user@gmail.com. Hit submit. And notice it seems to essentially just refresh the page, but pay attention to what actually happened here in my URL. In my URL, now I see at the very end, user email is equal to user%40gmail.com. And basically %40 is a code for the @ symbol. And we now can see that when I click submit, I'm basically assigning whatever input I had there to that name. Let's try this again. I will call this HTML, and instead of entering email, I'm going to try just with a very basic text input. So I will say type, let's say enter here text. I will say type is equal to text, and then give this name something like user input. We'll save this, refresh, and now I see enter text. Let's say enter text, and I will type in my stuff here, click submit, and we see now in the URL, we see forms.html with user input is equal to my stuff. So we can begin to get this idea that when I click submit, I'm actually assigning whatever is inputted to the name that the input tag had. Now what I want to do is explore the idea of an action occurring when I hit the submit button. So far right now when I hit submit, it basically just refreshes the page. Let's see if we can perform an action to go to another web page or another website upon clicking that submit button. So we come back here to form and put an action in. And then we can pass in a web page. Now a lot of times you won't be passing in another website, you'd pass in another web page within your own web application. But right now, since we don't have a full backend, we'll just say the action is equal to HTTP, and we can say HTTPS www. Let's say facebook.com. And then we need to also supply the method, and we'll say it's a get value method. We're going to be talking a lot more about method and get versus post in future lectures, but right now let's just keep it simple by saying upon clicking the submit button, the action I want you to do is go ahead and go to facebook.com, and we'll see that we still retain that user input. So let me call HTML again, or forms.html. Here we see enter text, and let's just make sure that's working by saying enter text and take me to FB for Facebook. And we'll refresh this, and now we see enter text and take me to FB. So I will enter some text here. So we'll say hello world, hit submit, and let's see what happens. Now it takes me to https://facebook.com with the user input equal to hello world. So we can begin to get this idea that upon clicking that submit button, I can call actions to take me to other web pages within my entire web application along with the actual input. So what might be nice is upon clicking submit, it actually takes me to that user profiles page based off what they inputted in these input tags. All right, now we don't know enough about the back end to actually handle a lot of this stuff. Right now we're basically just working all of this on the front end, but hopefully it's pretty impressive what just pure HTML can do by itself. Let's go back here to forms, and then finally talk about labels. Labels is going to be just a very quick topic on this. So I will delete this and go back to a normal form, click save, and then show something very simple. Something like enter some text, and then in this input, I'm just going to be having it say text. We'll save this, refresh, and it says enter some text. So I can just say hello world, etc. Now, something I want to notice here is that when I call this paragraph, this input type text becomes a new block. So it's not on the same line as this paragraph. Something I may want to do is actually label all the text inputs on a form. So a form may have various inputs. It may have multiple text inputs. Maybe you're filling out a job application online and you have various text boxes to fill out. Something you may want to do is try to label them. And there's two ways of doing it. We'll show you the technically bad way of doing it, which is individual, and then we'll show you the way you should be doing it. So if I just type in label, or begin to type it in, I get this label tag filled out with this for parameter. And we're going to discuss what that for parameter means in just a second. But right now we'll show you kind of the quote-unquote bad way of doing it. It's basically just a more repeatable way, but the reason we don't want that is because we want to practice dry coding principles, dry standing for DRY, or don't repeat yourself. So if I call this over here and paste it into that label, so here's my input type, and then I say enter text, save this, and now refresh that form page, I can see now that the label is on the same code block as the actual input, and that's what I wanted. But now, let's say I have multiple inputs. Something I may have to do now is just keep calling labels. So I'll say something like, again, enter text, call the input type, and text. And let's give these values. We'll say this is block 1, just so it's clear. We'll call this block 2. Save that, refresh the page, and we can see here I say enter text block 1, enter text block 2. Something, however, that I don't want to do is constantly be repeating myself. So I don't want to have to actually call label enter text, etc. That's where that for parameter comes into play. So we just showed how to use a label individually, but now let's show how to use a label with that for parameter. So I will again call label, and here I have the for parameter. And what I will do is match this up to a new parameter that we're going to learn about called ID. So we'll say this is for user input, and then say something like enter input. And notice that inside of these label tags, it's just the text. I haven't actually passed in the input tag yet. Then outside of this, I'm going to say input. We'll say this is type text, and we'll give it a value, something like hello. And we'll also give it an ID. And ID is something we're going to be exploring a lot more when we talk about CSS in the next section. But for now, I just want to make sure that ID links up and matches the for. And basically what this is saying is it's saying, okay, this label is for the ID user input. And there is the actual label. And then we can see that the input has this ID user input, which means it's going to link this label to this input. So let's refresh this. Well, let's save it and then refresh this. And we can see here, enter input has been linked to this text box. And I didn't actually have to now put that input into this label. And this is just a bit of a nicer and more common way to see label being used. right now it may not make a whole lot of sense because we haven't really covered ID yet, and we haven't really covered how to connect an ID to another file. But right now, just consider the idea that ID is a possible parameter for uniquely identifying an HTML tag. And that whole concept is going to make a lot more sense. We want to uniquely style HTML tags based off some sort of ID. And that's how we're going to be finding them, based off of this ID. All right, so far we covered forms, how to perform an action with a form, how to label an input, and then how to use label with the for parameter. The last thing I want to mention are two extra parameters you can put into an input, and that is, instead of a value, you can use a placeholder. So notice when I use value, I actually have to manually delete what's already in there. A lot of times on the internet, instead of a value, you will see something called a placeholder. So let's save that and refresh the page, and we can see here we have a placeholder, and it's a little more faint in the font color. And that's because when I click on this, it will basically immediately disappear as soon as I start typing something. So that's much more common to see when you're building a website that has a placeholder instead of a value. So you'll often see things such as enter email, or like enter email here if this was an email input. So I'll refresh this, says enter email here, and as soon as I click this and start typing stuff, that placeholder goes away. That's a much better way of using stuff to actually be a placeholder instead of a value. And the last thing I want to show you is this required argument. So basically what happens is when you pass in required here, it doesn't require anything to say required equals, it's just required. And basically what that means is when you click submit something, you need to make sure that it has this. So let me show you an example of that. We will say enter text here, and let's add in some more inputs. So let's just, to make it simple, we'll get rid of this label, and we will get rid of this ID, and we will have this text input as well as another text input, and this will have a placeholder, and this will say not required, and then finally we will have an input with a submit button. Submit, and we will give that the value, whoops, let's expand that again. We will give that the value just submit. And then this will have a placeholder saying required. As you may have guessed, basically when we click submit, we are required to have input in this second text box. So I will refresh this. We see not required and required. So if I just put stuff in required, so I say hello, and don't put anything in not required, click submit, I don't have any problems, the page just refreshes. But now let's try it again. I'll zoom back in, and we will, let's get rid of this little pop-up. We will put something in not required, so hello, but not put anything in the required. I hit submit, and notice it says, please fill out this field. And all of that is happening with your browser, this recognizing that, hey, this HTML says that this input is required, so you must put something in there before clicking the submit button, or I'll give you a warning. And that's the difference between something being required and not required. All right, I know we covered a lot in this lecture, so let's briefly talk about it one more time. We talked about forms, how we can state an action to link to another web page, and then we can say method equals to get to actually complete that action. Then we talked about labels, how you can use an individual label to actually label one of your inputs. And then finally, we talked about the use of the for parameter with label, as well as placeholders instead of values, and the required parameter. Okay, thanks everyone, and I will see you at the next lecture. Everyone, and welcome back to Part 6, Form Selections. In this lecture, we're going to continue exploring the variety of input methods for HTML forms. And those are going to be things such as a single radio button, how to link multiple radio buttons, drop-down menus, and then text area inputs. Coming up next after this lecture will be an assessment exercise, so we can fully understand everything that has to do with HTML forms. And that will end our HTML sections of the course. But before we reach the next assessment, let's get some quick practice with these various input methods. Alright, so here I have a normal HTML file open, and it's linked to my browser. It's just called forms.html, and you can see here I've set the title to hotel feedback. So we now know enough HTML that we can try to mimic more of a real-world situation. For instance, let's say you've stayed in a hotel. Afterwards, they may send you an email to a link asking for some feedback. So we're going to try to mimic what that feedback page would look like. And to do this, let's just start with a heading that says something like hotel feedback form. Save this, refresh over here. Looks like it's linked correctly. Great. Now let's start with our form. And if you just auto create form, it'll have class, action, method, etc. Right now we don't really need that. If you want, you can set method to just be get right now. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be covering what get and post is much more in the future. Right now, you can just leave it as you see it here. First thing I want to do is understand how radio buttons work. So for instance, if you just type in input, and in type, instead of text, you pass in radio, you can save this, refresh, and you see a little radio button pop up here. And if I click it, I can see that it got filled in. But right now, if I try to click it again, nothing changes. I can't click it on and off. It's just clicking once. So let's try to expand on this concept by actually asking a question here. So in a header or heading 3, I'm going to say this. Are you from inside the US or outside the US? So maybe we have international travelers and we want to know, do they come from the United States or outside the United States if this hotel is in the United States or somewhere internationally. And then we'll have an input as a radio button, and we will label this radio button. And let's review how we can label using that for method. So I can say something like for in US, and then give this particular radio button an ID of in, let's say, in USA. So let's save that. And in this label, I'm going to say something like inside. Save it, refresh, and here we see, are you from inside the US or outside the US? And right now I can just highlight the only option available, inside, and I can only highlight it on, I can't change anything about it. So let's make another one. We'll make another label. We'll call this for out USA, and we will call this outside, and then create another input. We'll make another radio button type and give it the ID to match that label, which in our case is out USA. We will save this, refresh, and now we see we have a hotel feedback form, and we have two options, inside or outside. But right now we have a little bit of a problem. I can actually highlight inside, highlight outside, and that's it. That's all I can do right now. What I would really like to do is to link these two radio buttons together, so that if I click inside, then outside cannot be selected. Or if I click outside, then inside cannot be selected. So I want to be able to turn these on and off in respect to each other. And the way you do that is you give them the same name. And that's where this name comes into play. So let's give this first radio button a name, LOC, for location. And let's give the second one the same name, LOC. Now let's save this, refresh, and we notice if I click inside, it's highlighted. If I click outside, inside becomes unhighlighted. So we can see now that they're linked because they share the same name. And that makes sense because given what we know about names and the assignment, we'll have to assign something to that name. And in this case, we can only assign one of these two. So it'll either be inside or outside. And that's how you link radio buttons together. You just give them the same name. They can have different labels, but if you want to link them together, you just give them the same name. All right, let's start exploring another type of input here. And this one is going to be, let's say, we'll ask, how was your service? So how was your service? Save that, make sure it worked. All right, so how was your service? And let's actually make this header 2 instead of just a paragraph, so it kind of matches along with the other one. And let's make this other one header 2, so it's not so big. So we'll say header 2 over here as well, H2. Save that, refresh over here. So are you from inside the US, outside? That's linked together. How was your service? For this service, what we're going to do is explore a drop-down menu. And the way a drop-down menu works is not with the input tag, but with the select tag. And the select tag works like this. You say select. You can give it a class. Right now, that doesn't make sense for us because we haven't learned about CSS, so we'll come back to that later. And we can give it a name. So let's give this the name stars. So we want a drop-down menu of how many stars. And what we can do is give an option. And then this option has a value. So let's give this a value of great. And in between these option tags is going to be an actual number. So we'll say 3. Let's save this and see what this looks like so far. So here we have the drop-down, 3. And so far, that's it. So let's create a couple more options for this drop-down menu, and then we can break down what value is. So I'm going to make another value that just says, OK. That's 2. And then let's make one more option. And we will say this is bad, and it was 1 star. So now if I save this, I have my select, which indicates a drop-down menu. I've given a name to my select, and I have various options here, with what happens in between the option tags is what's actually displayed to the user. But behind the scenes, they can have their own values. So let's refresh this. And now that we say, how is your service? I see this drop-down gives me 3, 2, or 1 that I can choose from. So let's add a submit button to this so we can see what happens when I hit submit. So outside of this, but inside the form, I'm going to create a submit button and give it a value called submit. Save that and refresh. And now let's pay attention to what happens to the URL after I hit submit. I'll say I'm from inside the US and my service was 2. So now that I've clicked submit, we see here in the URL that I have LOC is equal to, and right now it's actually blank, and then it says and stars is equal to OK. So what I want to do is back in these radio buttons, actually fill in a value here that corresponds to the radio button. So I will set the value for inside, for the inside radio button, and set the value here for outside. Let's save this and refresh, and let's actually delete these values here. Go back to the forms page, refresh this, and now let's try again. We'll say hotel feedback form. Are you from inside? We'll say we're from inside. How was the service? We'll give it 1 star. And notice here, now I have corresponding values in both the drop-down menu and the radio buttons. So if I click submit, now I can see here in the URL that my LOC, the name, is equal to the value inside, since I chose inside. And stars is equal to the value here, bad. And that's a really nice way that you can have your own value names on your back end, but show something else on the front end. So notice that the front end here, especially for the drop-down menu, was 3, 2, 1, but on the back end, I had these set values, great, okay, bad. What might be more realistic is if you actually set values on to numerical values, 3, 2, 1, and then here the options are great, okay, bad. And then you can maybe take mathematical averages behind the scenes. But we're going to learn a lot more about back-end stuff later on in this course. But hopefully you get an idea now of what's possible. Finally, I want to add one more type of input that we want to check out, and that's the text area input. So I'm going to put a paragraph here, and we'll have a question that says something like, any other feedback you want to give as a paragraph? Well, let's actually make that a header too. That way it's the same size as everything else. And we so far have learned about the text input. In fact, it's the default. So if I click save here, refresh, I see any other feedback. But usually you don't want the user to just type everything in one single line. You want an actual box text area. So the way we can do that is instead of text, we can say text area. And that actually creates its own text area tag. So I will delete this and say text area. We can give that a name. So we can just use the default here, or we can say my text. And you give it a number of rows and a number of columns you want it to expand. So let's save this and now refresh. And see here, now I have my text area. So hello, this is my text area. And now we have multiple lines that we can start typing stuff in. And we're going to learn more about text areas right now because it's a little different than taking in a single value because you have whole blocks of text. But I just want you to be aware that you have a text area here at your disposal. Alright, so that's it for the various types of inputs we wanted to cover here under form selections. Let's do a quick review. Let me expand this. We've covered how to do radio buttons. Remember, that's just input and the type is radio. And if you want to link radio buttons together, you make sure the group of radio buttons just has the same name. And you can assign values to them so that once you click submit, you can get those values back. Then for a drop-down menu, you use the select tag with options. And you can then again assign values, and the values don't have to match up what the user actually sees as their drop-down options. And then finally we learned about the text area, which allows you to basically make a block for a text area. And if we come back here to the browser, we can see that we can actually kind of play around with this a little bit as far as how far down it can go. And then finally we have the submit button that we've covered before. Alright, coming up next is an assessment exercise so you can get a lot of practice with everything we've covered in this section of the course. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture. Hello everyone and welcome back. We've reached the end of HTML level 2, so we'll have an assessment. For this assessment, you're just going to be recreating the front end of a basic sign-up page for some sort of online course website. So check out the file HTML level 2 assessment.html. Just copy that full file path and put it into your browser. Try not to actually look at the HTML, and let's explore it before you begin because it's what you're going to be recreating for your assessment. Alright, so here I have the file and I've zoomed in a bit so we can see it clearly. We have a heading here, course sign-up page, and then it also says, please note, first name, last name, password, and email are required. So you're going to have to make sure that those fields have some sort of way of being required when you click submit. Review the lectures if you don't remember how to do that. And you'll notice that this first name, last name, and email also have some placeholders. So I see something here that says first name, and I type and it goes away. And then we also have password. Make sure that if you type something into password, it's hidden from view. Then we say, are you over the age of 18? And we have 2 radio buttons. Note that as I click yes and no, it changes, so that means they're linked somehow. And then finally, we have this, do you have a credit card or PayPal? And we have a drop-down menu that says either choose credit card or PayPal. Another way you could have interpreted this question is, do you have a credit card or PayPal, yes or no? Really, I just care that you remember how to do a drop-down menu. And then you can click sign up, and basically, well, I need to fill this out. So let's do that at gmail.com, some password, sign up, and nothing should happen. It just basically refreshes to, in my case, the non-zoomed in version. But you can see up here in the URL that this has changed. All right, as a bonus, if you feel that this is pretty easy, what I want you to do is see if you can select an action to actually connect this form to some other HTML page that you've written, maybe a thank you page. So when you click sign up, see if you can link it to a thank you page as a bonus through an action. All right, best of luck, and I will see you at the next lecture where we actually code through this. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the solutions lecture for the HTML Level 2 assessment. Let's get started by jumping straight to the editor. All right, so here I have the editor and the course sign up page opened. I'm just going to start straight from scratch, but remember this is what we're trying to recreate here with HTML. So the first thing we want to do is just call HTML, give this some sort of title. We'll just say course sign up, and then let's start off with the body. So here we can see there's some sort of heading 1, and we will say course sign up page to match that. And then we have what appears to be a paragraph. You could have done heading 2 or heading 3, that's fine. And we'll say, please note, we'll say all text fields required, just to save us some time. And then we start with the real business, which is the form. So I'll call the form right now, and we will remove class, action, and post. There was a bonus on the action, which we'll cover in just a little bit towards the end. But let's start off with the basic form. First thing you want it to do is the inputs. So we have a first name input and a last name input. Let's grab those inputs. The first name is just a text input. It has no value, but it does have a placeholder. So let's put that in here. We'll put a placeholder in that says first name. And then let's just label this. We'll give it a label, and we'll say it's for FM, for first name, and we'll give the input an ID of FM. And then let's come back up here and give it the label first name colon. All right, and we're going to do a very similar thing for the last name. So let's do that as well. Let's copy this and paste it. Let's make this last name. Let's come up here and change this to LM for last name. It looks like I accidentally wrote M instead of N. So let's change those on both of these, LN and FN. It's first name, last name. And then the placeholder here, instead of first name, it's going to say last name. All right, so far we have, an extra T there. So far we have the first 2 inputs for the first name and the last name. Let's save this and make sure we're connected, make sure everything's working correctly. So I will delete that, hit enter, and it looks like we're good to go here. We have the course sign up page, all the text fields are required, first name and last name. So something to remember is that they're all required, which means I need to add one more parameter here in my input, which is just the required keyword. And I need to do the same thing here, required. And you can see that Adam is already ready to help me out. And you just need to, you could say it equals to true, but that's all I really need here. Okay. Then up next, we want the email that we had earlier. So again, I will say input. This time, I'll say email, and I will give the placeholder, and let's just say the placeholder is user@gmail.com or something like that. Can't remember quite what it was, but we'll put in a label here, and we'll say this label is for let's say email, or let's call it mail, so we don't confuse it with the type, and give it an ID of mail. And then for the label, we will say email. And then finally, we also want a password. So again, I will make a label here. We'll say it's for pass. We'll call password there. And then create the input for it. Input, and you'll notice this becomes a lot faster when you're using Adam's really helpful autocomplete. So we will say password and no placeholder there. Let's save this and see what it looks like so far. And we're probably gonna have to change something. Note that we have a bit of a basically no gap between first name, last name, email, and password. So one quick fix we can do that, since we don't know styling yet, is to just in between first name and last name, add some paragraph tags to insert another block there, and we can just keep them blank. So now when I refresh this, we get a little empty block there. Later on when we learn about CSS, we're going to learn how we can actually call styling for buffers and margins, etc. But right now we can just use this little cheat. Okay, so we have all the text fields, and let's make sure we have them all required. So we still need to add those to the last two we just created. So required. And then down here we also want to add in required. And you don't need to say equals in our case, we can just say required there. Then up next we want to get some radio buttons to ask if we're over the age of 18, yes or no. So let's put a paragraph in here saying, are you over 18? Question mark. We'll need two inputs, and they're both going to be radio. It's going to be an input. We'll call it radio. And remember, if we want them to be linked, they need to share the same name. So we'll call them both over. Asking if they're over 18. And let's give them a label. So we'll say label for Y is yes, and then give the first one an ID of Y, and then so we can recognize it later, let's give it a value of yes. And let's give this one a value of no, and give it a label. And the reason for that is later on, whatever they select, I can reference the value there. So we'll put in a label here for n, give it an ID equal to n, and then here it's going to be no. So let's save that, make sure everything's working correctly for us. Are you over 18? Let's make sure they're linked together, and it looks like that's working just fine. All right, we can even expand this a little bit. And now let's check out the last thing we needed to do, which was a drop-down. Do you have a credit card or PayPal? So let's just say, do you have a card or PayPal? Question mark. And remember, the drop-down doesn't use an input tag. Instead, it uses a select tag. So we have select. We can give it a class, but we don't worry about that. We can also give it a name. Let's just give it a simple name. We'll say payment. And then finally, inside of this, we have the option tags. So option 1, we'll say this is a value of CC. And we'll give it the actual name on the HTML, credit card. Or excuse me, not really a name, but what it's actually going to display. And then the next option, value here, we'll say PP for PayPal, and then PayPal there. So let's save that, make sure it's working when I refresh this. Do you have a credit card or PayPal? And here we can select them. Perfect. And when I actually click submit, I'll get back a value either CC or PP for payment. Okie dokes. Finally, let's use that paragraph trick again and input the submit button. So input, submit, and the value we'll give it is sign up. And let's save this. And let's confirm that it all worked. We'll refresh this. We'll put in a first name, put in a last name, put in some email. It's just made up. And then some password, over 18, credit card, sign up. It should just basically refresh the page. And if we look over here on the URL, if I expand this, I see the options that I wanted. Perfect. All right. So what we can do now is to expand on this, you could add values. So you could give password a value and email a value if you want them to show up here in the URL after clicking submit. But that doesn't help us too much right now because we don't know how to use stuff on the back end to actually grab those values. So we'll leave it there for now. What I want to address is the actual bonus question, which was how can you make this sign up link to another page or another HTML file? And remember, we can do that through an action. So I will call action here. And what I will do is I will create, if I bring back my directory with control or command \, I'll create a new file here and we'll say thank you.html. And here it's just going to be an HTML file with one heading saying thank you. We will save that. And then the action is going to take us to that thank you.html. And the method will be get. Save that. So it looks really similar to what we showed earlier when we actually linked it to the Facebook page, but instead now the action is linking to a local HTML. And make sure it's in the same directory, that we don't have to pass in the whole file path. You just pass in thankyou.html. So I will save that, refresh this, and let me make sure I refresh that correctly. Hit enter. Okay, course sign up page. Let's zoom out a little bit so it's still okay. I'll put in the same information as last time, Portilla, some made up email address, made up password, over 18, credit card, sign up, and it takes us to the thank you page. Hopefully you're able to figure out that bonus as well. But what I really want you to see is now we're actually ready to almost level up to understanding how we can link pages together. And that's going to be a really big part of creating a web application, how pages link to each other, and how your whole web application is designed to interact within itself. All right, so let's just quickly review everything we just did by grabbing this guy and expanding it. So what we had to do is created that heading 1, just a paragraph. We had the form, and if you did the bonus, you wanted to select action and method to some other HTML page you had, or if you wanted to just another website. Remember, for the website, you need to pass in HTTPS, etc. Otherwise, it'll start looking in the local namespace, which means on your computer. Then we wanted to use labels. We had the input for these texts. Remember, we had to make sure they were all required. We had the first name, last name, have the placeholders, make sure they're required. This little trick for the paragraph. Don't worry if you didn't get that yet. You won't need it later on when we actually learn about CSS. So if you were having difficulty with that, don't sweat it. It's kind of a trick. Then coming up next, we had to have this email label, password. Again, it was required. Are you over 18? Big trick here is when you're dealing with radio buttons and you want them to be linked together, make sure they have the same name. In this case, it was over and over. And assigning values to the text fields wasn't really necessary for our use case, but obviously you will have to assign values to them when we're dealing with a full web application. So keep that in mind. Then finally, we had this drop-down menu of card or PayPal, and that's the select tag with the option tag. And then we had the submit button. Okay, hope you enjoyed that assessment exercise, and you basically know enough HTML now to continue on with the rest of the course. Thanks everyone, and I will see you at the next section.